All right. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Kenny Connolly, and I've got Nick Blevins with me, and we're having a conversation. This is a actually bonus content that goes along with a resource we recently released called New Family Retention Project that helps churches improve how they retain new families to come visit their church. So, Nick, thanks for joining with this conversation today.
You bet. I'm excited to talk about new family retention.
Right. So specifically, this is just going to be a short video where in the resource, if you have bought this resource, and obviously this is going to guide you in utilizing content that we've built out in our framework. But if you haven't checked out our new family retention plan, you can click on the link in the notes to view more information about that or to purchase this resource. But what we wanted to do is take a few minutes just to unpack the actual word retention, because even when you talk about retention, if you were to get like 5 or 6 different pastors in a room, you talk about retention, you're going to get probably 4 or 5 different, actually wildly different definitions of what retention looks like. So just for curiosity, Nick, when you guys talk about retention, how do you guys define it for your church?
Well, the main thing I think about is when I hear retention, and I think what you said that everybody has a different definition. I think that's true of like guests too. Like, how do you count first-time guests? When I have those conversations, I hear we count cards, or we count individuals in our system, or we count family units or something like that. But when I think retention in our church, forever, I have thought of who is still here a year after they started coming. That's like the way I've thought about it. And we try to measure a bunch of different things. And I wouldn't even say our whole staff is on board or thinks about that or knows what that number is. But that's the way that I've looked at it, and we've tracked it in our dashboard, is what % of the people that were new last year are still attending this year.
Right, and that's true. And a lot of churches, because like there's not a lot of data online either, as far as like if you're wanting to look at what retention actually means, like how that data is measured and collected varies from different churches. So you might be using a different definition from what some best practices exist out there. At my church here in Arizona, it's a metric that we've been utilizing for years, and it's actually we measure when somebody and we run this report every single Sunday, and it's when somebody visits for the 3rd time within 12 weeks, we consider that person retained. And so we look at various metrics of even people who become retained who fall off, several months later or whatever it may look like. But that's kind of like our metric. So it's like 3 times in 3 months. That's how we consider retained. So ultimately, we kind of created this resource of retention for new families at your church. But we had to kind of write this resource in such a way that it didn't completely conform to one set of measurements. So we wanted to have a little bit of conversation today. Nick, I know you have researched this quite a bit too over your years and looking at numbers. You're a numbers guy. And, what are some of the best practices that you've come across, like what some churches, when they talk about retention of, I know you were just telling me a little while ago, like the difference between first-time attenders and second-time attenders, and what good retention looks like at most churches. What do you know? Kind of explain to us a little bit about what the experts say about retention.
Sure. I think there aren't a lot of experts saying anything about retention. I think that's part of the problem is, and when you ask people about retention, I might be extreme on this, but in my experience, asking churches about retention and tracking it, I'd say maybe 10%, if that, even do that. In fact, I just had a conversation last week with somebody at a large influential church that pretty much everybody watching this video would know, and they don't track it. They don't track it. They were just putting some things into place a few months ago, but right now they don't even track it. And so I think that's a lot of churches, large and small. There's a few resources that have been out there in regards to this that I usually reference, but again, I don't feel like they've been well tested, and there's not a lot of data to support them. One is Nelson Searcy. In his book, he'll talk about the various numbers he experienced working with churches. And it all comes down to thinking that most churches actually keep a very low % of their first-time guests, like 5 or 10%. And that the goal, like he would push and challenge you to, can you get it to 20 or 30%? Now, that's not the numbers he uses. He uses a whole different kind of formula, but that's what it translates to. And then the book, What Every Pastor Should Know, in there they talk about, and I believe this was from a survey, a small survey, that you should keep 20% of your first time guests, 40% of your second time guests. So if they come back a second time, you should be able to keep more of them. So 40% of them and 60% of your third time guests. So those are some of the numbers that are used. However, I've just found that they're not supported by a lot of data. So we hope this resource will help people, whatever your number is, track it and make it better.
Right. And that's the whole interesting part, because even those numbers that we share with you, we're not even 100% sure, like, again, how they measure retention, whether it's a year from now, 6 months from now. But the reality is, like, we really believe this with all our heart, is that most churches have a backdoor problem. And we have people coming all the time. And oftentimes we pay a lot of attention to how many people we can get through our front door. But maybe, and we kind of reference this a lot in this resource, is that the low-hanging fruit of church growth is actually retention. If the biggest obstacle is to get somebody to come to your church for the very first time. And if they've come, then you've taken away all the, I don't know what to expect, I don't know where to go, I don't know what to dress, I don't know what, all those things. So if we could just get them to come back one more time, and if it significantly increases their chance of actually becoming a regular attendee or part of the community of your church, then retention becomes really strategic. And so we just wanted to take a few minutes to kind of define what retention might actually look like. And once you choose a definition, then you stick with it. And then you measure it over a period of time. So in this course, like, again, we kind of leave that definition up to you to a certain degree. What we do cover in our framework is obviously first-time attendance. So anytime someone comes for first time, we've created an entire framework around what you should do, what you should say, when you should say it, when you should do these things. And then we also put a lot of emphasis on their second-time visit, because we're also looking for, when somebody comes back within a certain amount of time, there's certain things that we should do. And this is following the kind of, some of the research that's out there, but then also the common sense rule that if somebody's coming back for a second time and we can wow them again on their second time, if we could make, the church feel small, connected, personal on their second visit, the chance they can come back a third or fourth time is significantly higher. And that's really kind of how we built the framework. After your second time visit, it really becomes, up to you. What is your church view as retained? Or like for my church, is if we can get somebody to come back for that third time within, that first 12 weeks, then done for us. We've considered them retained. Now, for another church who might look at like a year from now, how you measure retention, it might have this, longer, far out view of what retention actually looks like, but you can still moderate like people on the pathway toward retention, things like that. So that's kind of like maybe a 30,000 foot view of retention. So as you're diving into the content from, first time family retention plan, you can know what we're talking about when we consider retention. You begin formulating what is your measurement tool for retention, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you. We don't go into all this nitty gritty detail in all the documents, but having a kind of a broad understanding of what retention looks like is going to be helpful for when you design your plan. Nick, any last things you want to add to this?
Yeah, I would say, so when like you asked me the question, what do I think of as retention? And that's probably the first thing I think of is, who's still here a year later. The resource is more focused on the first few months. The idea is like, we're defining retention in the resource loosely as you're either connected somehow in a group or serving, or you're attending regularly. And that way churches can then define their own, what is retention. But the resource is focused on, the first few months. It's not really looking at a year later or something like that. But my encouragement is to measure all of your own steps. Again, it's hard to find something to compare it to, but at least you can compare it to yourself. How well are you doing this year compared to last year? And in the new family retention plan, we have a section on like a metrics and a dashboard, and there's a sample sheet in there that actually shows you how you can measure each step of the process, the framework that we've defined in the resource. And if you just did that, that would be really helpful. Like we just started recently, last year, maybe 2 years ago, measuring the percent of people that go from they've attended to they came and visited us at our new here area in the lobby. What percent of them are coming to our starting point, which is kind of like our orientation first step kind of class. And then what percent of them are getting in a group or serving. And the numbers get smaller as you go, right? The percent that do each thing gets smaller and smaller. But the thing that we're interested in is comparing it to last year and next year. And I've had some conversations with other church leaders where, you know what, they measure that exact same thing. Okay, so let's talk. What is your number? I talked to one church that was very different from one campus to the next. They're a multi-site church, and I thought that was interesting. So my recommendation would be define it. That's what we're saying. It is loose. There isn't a one right definition, but define it and then measure it so you can, improve.
No, that's good. And I like, what you said is when you focus on the things on the front end, it is more likely going to have an effect on the things on the back end. And it's kind of like if you've read 4 Disciplines of Execution, it's this whole idea of lead measures versus lag measures. And so like ultimately in the end, we want to increase the number of people that we retain as a church, but it might be, what you just described a second ago is measuring first time attendees, the number of people that come to the Welcome Center and all those different things, and by measuring those, hopefully it changes the percentage of people who are retained a year later or 6 months later or whatever it is that you measure that. But those are all great things to think about. Again, no clear, specific, this is what you should do, this is how you should measure it. But you have to figure that out for your own church, because it could be that your church already has some, or your denomination or your connection to churches or your multi-site, whatever it may be, already has some definition around retention, but it doesn't mean that you can't clarify some of those things for measurement, specifically when it comes to new families visiting your church. Okay, so I think that wraps up this first conversation. Super simple, super short, super quick, but hopefully it provides a little bit of a framework and a background for defining retention within your ministry. Thanks for joining us. Again, if you have any questions, dive into this resource, let us know, and we'd love to help you retain more families who come to visit your church.